was 15 years old. I remember it was the first time I was ever traveling by myself to Cairo. And I remember getting to the boarding gate and the lady said, "I'm sorry, where's your transit visa?" I said, "I'm only in Vienna for 2 hours." She's like, "I'm sorry, Iraqis now require you to have a visa to transit in the country." Imagine the craziness. They spin the globe, they look to see where an Iraqi can go, and they found that I'm allowed to travel to and stay in their transit hall and wait for a flight to go to Cairo. My bag had arrived. I mean, it was torn open. It was just a disaster. When I got the US passport 2-3 years later, it's unbelievable because everybody at that point was so kind and generous. Oh my God. I think the best way to kind of answer that is the fact that I wasn't able to travel as much as I had wanted to when I was a child. And the reason for that is my family is from Iraq. And being Iraqi, and I was born around 1970, 1980, just at the start of the Iran-Iraq war, traveling was somewhat restricted. I was born in Switzerland, grew up there until I was about 3, and then traveled throughout the Middle East and then ended up in America, largely as I guess a kind of an immigrant. I wouldn't say a refugee, but an immigrant in the United States around 1984, 1985. And I think from that period through to when I finally got the US passport in 1997, even though I traveled, it was very restricted. And having someone tell you you cannot travel, or you have to have visas, or you have to stay in this transit lounge and you can't exit the airport, things like that really were frustrating. I remember as a child, my dad teased me because he put up a huge map on the wall with all the flags and all the countries as a map, and I memorized it. And I kind of really wanted to slowly but surely start to see it. And I couldn't. And even though I was young, I still obviously couldn't even get to these places. And so I think when I got the US passport, when I was around 17 years old, I decided never to take traveling, or I guess the freedom of mobility, for granted. And I think that was a very, very important part and start to my desire to see the world. That being said, I don't know if anybody starts off, well, maybe they do, I want to see the world. I think people start off saying, I want to travel. And then one travel becomes 2 becomes 4, 6 countries, 8 countries. Then you start doing things a little bit differently. You're outside of Europe. You're in more, difficult countries to travel to. And I would say probably around my mid-20s is when I realized, hang on a second, I'm onto something. I love doing this. I would say through my late 20s into my 30s, that's when I really was pushing it very hard. And I'll give you one memory that really stuck in my head. I remember very distinctly, I was in California for the summer. I was 15 years old, and my father had just traveled from California, where he was with us, to Egypt, where he was waiting for us. And I was heading back to Egypt to start schooling. And I remember it was the first time I was ever traveling by myself. And I was traveling from Los Angeles to New York to Vienna, Vienna to Cairo. And I remember getting to New York and going to the boarding gate, and I showed her my Iraqi passport to get on my flight to go to Vienna, and then from Vienna to head off to Cairo. And I remember getting to the boarding gate, and the lady said, "I'm sorry, where's your transit visa?" I said, "I'm only in Vienna for 2 hours in a transit hall and then heading off to Cairo." She's like, "I'm sorry, unfortunately, Iraqis now require you to have a visa to transit in the country." Imagine the craziness. All you're doing is landing, going to a transit hall in the airport, waiting, getting on another plane, getting out, and you needed a visa for that, as if I was going to jump out of the airport. So I said, "I don't have one." So she said, "Unfortunately, we can't have you go through Vienna." The next thing you know, I'm flying through, they spin the globe, they look to see where an Iraqi can go, and they found that I'm allowed to travel to Morocco and stay in their transit hall and wait for a flight to go to Cairo. I had to wait about 15 hours there in the transit hall. They wouldn't let me leave into the main airport. I had to stay in like a small area. And then finally I arrived 2 days later to Cairo. My dad was so upset. My bag had arrived, it was lost. It was torn open. It was just a disaster. I think for me, my ability to travel is also facilitated by the fact that I could work, almost all my work is remote. As I said, I went to a lot of graduate schools. I'm a lawyer by background, so it allows me to do legal work from almost anywhere that I go. And also I own a admissions consulting business that helps students in terms of their applying to academic programs. That also gives me flexibility. So my style has been to kind of intersperse work with my travel, as in when I'm traveling, I can work from almost anywhere. I try to keep my trips to about 2 weeks, largely because I have family here in California, and I feel like if I start traveling, I'm never going to come back. I'm constantly going to be on the road. So I have to constantly remind myself that I have an anchor, and the anchor is coming back to California so I can be with my family. And also just in terms of work in general, I want to kind of be stationary here. I try to do it in spurts, go for 2 weeks. It keeps me very efficient. And I try to do it very intentionally. And I can't say that was the case before. Before, in my 30s, I was working with the US government as an international lawyer, doing international development. And so I traveled constantly for the US government, living in Washington, DC. So I kind of used my travels with the US government and then would use it to pivot off other places and then keep it within 2 to 3 days. But a lot of my travels, I have to say, were much more go into the country, quickly see it and leave. Still get the experience, but just kind of in and out. During COVID is when I came up with my brand, Final 50, which I suddenly realized as I was driving around, I was doing a lot of road trips during COVID. And I live in Los Angeles. So thank God for us here, we could go to, within about a day, you can travel to by car to like 10 different national parks. So I was constantly going to different national parks because I couldn't travel abroad. But I realized as I was driving that I was getting very close to the final 50 countries on earth. I was at about 146 countries or something like that. So I was like, wow, I'm getting really close. So then I suddenly came up with this idea of creating Final 50 to document my life experiences as I travel. When I started to document it, you can see right here, I created this channel called Final 50, and it became something like a very intentional life experience. And so for the last 2.5, 3 years since I created the account, I started kind of filming all the different places I would go to, much like a travel vlogger would, with using 3 kind of pillars, which are called the 3 E's: education, entertainment, and exploration. Like most recently, I did the half Ironman. And part of what I like to do is to kind of really get a sense of going and pushing your bounds. I love exercise. I love fitness. And even though I'm in my 40s, to me, being healthy, being fit is so, so important. So part of my travel experiences, it's running in every country. And so I've run in every country I've gone to in the last 8 years. So I've run in about 100 countries. Some of them I kind of wanted to make it more personal, like this one where I went to Geneva to see where I was born, the exact location. Some of them I had like crazy experiences and I was very fortunate to capture them, like in Namibia. I went to the World Cups. I've been to like 7 World Cups. That's very important to me. I love going to the World Cups. So I try to capture that here as well. For example, like this guy, I met him. He was just a taxi driver. He became my guide. For 3 days, we traveled together, right? Some other people here, like you can see this guy, he became a friend of mine in Mongolia and he took me all across the country to the steppes of Mongolia. The other one I quickly want to kind of highlight that was just unbelievable for me was Kilimanjaro. The trip I had done many years ago, about 10 years ago, and I just kind of relived the moment and recorded it for audiences. And what was beautiful about it, Rizvan, is that it was really about pushing yourself so much to get to the top. You gave yourself a goal. And I wasn't just kind of going through the motions and enjoying every day and looking at the flowers. I don't know what got in my head. I'm like, I have to get to the top of that mountain without succumbing to altitude sickness, without having, getting injured, sleeping well, eating well, and so forth. I think the moment that was so magical for me, and you asked me this question, like what really stuck out, was when I got to the top of Kilimanjaro. Because we woke up at 1 a.m. and we got there at 5:45. So like in 4.5 hours, we got to the summit. And I ran to the summit, even though the altitude really kind of affects you. But I ran to the summit and I just started crying, like just literally crying, sobbing. Me and my friend and the porter. I don't know why, but I find myself, I have to say, admit that when you're in these moments of bliss, you thank God that you're alive. You thank God that you're seeing it and witnessing it, because you know how many other people will never have that opportunity, either because they can't afford to travel, they don't have the time to travel, they're too ill to travel, or unfortunately, they died. Like I had good friends of mine that had passed away much earlier than one would have ever expected. And I know they'll never be able to see that moment. And we saw it. The sun is rising. The clouds are below you. You see the glacier. You see the crater. And you did it. You achieved it. And God gave you the ability, without you getting injured, without you getting sick, to see this moment. One of the things I always think about is stay curious. To me, if you stay curious, everything else in your life, at least in how your brain works, will continue functioning. I hope ever succumb to dementia, Alzheimer, brain disease, if you stay curious. To stay curious, you need to be motivated and determined. And I think that's what I have as a blessing from God, is that I'm curious, I'm determined, and I have a lot of energy, a lot of it. And those have been gifts from God because I was able to kind of channel that to travel. And because I'm constantly staying curious, you'll find me on Wikipedia or on Google every day, asking questions constantly. If I have a question I can't think of, I'm like, what does that mean? Boom, quickly Google it. And then I just remember it constantly. And that really helps you when you travel. At a minimum, I go to the Wikipedia page of every country I go to before I go. So I look about the economics, the politics, the history, the culture, the geography, right? And quickly read up on that. Then I start looking at it. I start blogging and taking a look what other people have done. Then I quickly get caught up in a Wikipedia whirlpool, right? Like a rabbit hole. And I start reading about the history. And so when I get there, you go from seeing a country in black and white to seeing a country in three-dimensional. I was around 30, 31, and I had never been to Iraq. So I'd already traveled to about 95 countries, but never to my country of origin, which was, for people, they're like, what?
Insane.
You've been to the most random places in the world, but you haven't even been to Iraq? And I'm like, I haven't been. It was 2011, and I had the opportunity to train speakers for the TED Talks, for TEDx in Baghdad, for it was the first time. And I remember going to my father and saying, listen, this is an opportunity. They've invited me to come to train these speakers. I'm gonna be in a secure location. Can I go? And I didn't necessarily need his permission. I was in my 30s, but I just wanted them to feel comfortable. And so he said, go. And I went to Iraq for the first time. And I remember that so distinctly because I met family there I'd never met in my life. I ate food that I had only heard about. And I was there helping these Iraqis, training them to be able to deliver their talk on the TED stage. And it was just unbelievably profound. And seeing Iraq for the first time and walking in the streets. And I hope to go back with my mother and explore Iraq more as an Iraqi, because I think there's something really profound about going back to your roots. I'd say the first person would be Ibn Battuta, which is weird. People are like, who's Ibn Battuta? Well, he was one of the most well-traveled individuals in history. He had actually traveled far more than Marco Polo. But, as history is written by the victors, Marco Polo got all the attention. Ibn Battuta didn't, but he traveled from Spain all the way to, along the Silk Route and so forth, through Africa and along the Silk Route. A really incredible person. And I thought to myself, what an amazing source of inspiration to meet someone like him. The second person I would have to say would be Da Vinci. Because this guy is the Renaissance man. I mean, this guy was inventing ways of painting, even though he didn't paint as often as one would imagine. I mean, he was the one who kind of drew up a prototype for a helicopter. He put together the Vitruvian Man, right? In terms of biology and anatomy. I mean, this man was something like, he was such a Renaissance figure at such a pivotal time in history. And being a lover of history, and the fact that the guy lived, I think, to his 70s or 80s, you could learn so much from someone so humble, having seen and achieved so much under so many different monarchies. The third person I would have to say is alive, and it would be Obama. And the reason for that is living in America, and you see how divisive this country is today, and how much it's been on the right and the wrong side of history. Obama for us was so important. And I remember going and campaigning for him and knocking on doors in 2008. And I remember when he won, it was such a moving experience for me that a man like him with his background could achieve something like presidency. And I would cry just thinking about that speech that he gave when he actually accepted that he became president in Chicago. I ask anybody to go back and listen to that speech because it was so incredibly moving from where we were then to where we are now. And he was so important in my life trajectory because I ended up working for the US government, even though I was against the war in Iraq, 100% against it. I ended up working for the US government because I believed in him. I believed in the mission.
Probably go through your videos, all of them, and I recommend everyone listening to this to do the same. I thank you again, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much, Razvan, and thank you to NomadMania for allowing me to have this opportunity to speak about my love for travel.